Was it marijuana, MS, diabetes, or some other reason the woman at Montgomery Airport in Alabama got too close to a running jet engine and was sucked into it? Let's do a deep dive on the medical report on this episode of Taking Off. Hi, I'm Dan Milliken, and there's been a lot of questions and, opinions, comments on our final report video last week about the tragic story of Courtney Edwards, the ramp worker who was ingested into a jet engine on New Year's Eve, December 31st, 2022. The NTSB has released their final report on the tragedy, as well as released the docket containing all the reports from the investigation. This includes the medical report, which has a few surprises in it that we'll go in depth on in a moment with an aviation doctor. But first, in case you haven't heard the story, let me quickly recap. At Montgomery Regional Airport on New Year's Eve 2022, Envoy Air Flight 3408, part of the regional family for American Airlines, landed without incident and taxied to the gate. The plane's auxiliary power unit, the APU, was inoperable, so the crew was planning to use one engine to maintain power on the plane until the ground crew connected a ground power source. And this isn't unusual in this situation, and the ground crew had been alerted and briefed to this. There were several safety meetings with the ground crew, including one 10 minutes before the plane arrived at the gate. Surveillance video backs this up, showing the briefing with the plane landing in the background. Courtney Edwards was in the meeting. She was standing next to the crew leader who was giving the briefing. And according to testimony from those in the meeting, it was made clear to everyone to stay back in the safety areas at least 15 feet away from the engines until the red beacon on the plane was extinguished, denoting it was then safe to approach the plane. There would still be the usual wing walkers to make sure the plane taxied up to the gate safely, but they were to wait until the beacon turned off before getting close to the plane. The plan was when the aircraft rolled to a stop, the crew leader was to guide the jet bridge in to connect the ground power. And as he started to do this, Courtney Edwards, who had been the wing walker on the left side, walked behind the left wing and stumbled from the jet blast coming from the idling number one or left engine. She then placed a cone at the tail, which the crew leader saw, and he waved her to stay back. And moments later, Courtney walked to the front of the wing from the tip toward the fuselage along the wing edge and stopped in front of the idling number one engine with her back to it. The jet bridge by this time was blocking the security camera, which could only see her legs. The crew leader continued to motion for her to get away, but when she took a step, the engine sucked her legs up into it, and then the engine rocked and immediately began to spool down, and a mass fell out in front of the engine. Emergency workers arrived and found Courtney deceased. In the NTSB final report, it was determined that Courtney's judgment was deficient, cognitive impairment. There were safety meetings, multiple clues available to her that the engine was still on, including the red beacon still being lit at the bottom and the top of the Embraer E-175 plane. So the question we're going to deep dive into is why her judgment was deficient. We're going to look at the medical report. Okay, for the factual information, Courtney was 34 years old. 8 years previously, multiple sclerosis first manifested. Then 2 years later, diabetes mellitus was diagnosed, and she was obese, according to the doctor. She was 5'7" and 203 pounds at her last doctor visit. Let's talk first about multiple sclerosis, MS. It's a chronic neurological disease that, in layman's terms, attacks the sheath around your neurons. Parts of your nervous system will short circuit, and this might manifest with vision problems like seeing double vision or blurred vision. Or maybe you start dragging a leg, or you can't hold on to your cup of coffee. It affects people differently. In this case, according to Courtney's neurologist, quote, she had times at work where her legs go to spaghetti or her arms don't cooperate, and these typically last up to a few hours. Sleeping it off helps. Further down, lifting is a struggle for her. Her vision went out 2 weeks ago. It got better. The neurologist documented that there was no evidence of new MS relapse and that the ramp agent's MS continued to be stable on fingolimod, which she had started in January 2016 and which seemed to be a good fit for her so far. So that's the MS. And then there was the diabetes. She had type 1, where you have a resistance to insulin, which leads to an increase in blood sugar, and it's controlled with medicine. Courtney, in addition to the fingolimod, was on liraglutide, metformin, gabapentin, amitriptyline, and vitamin D3. I reached out to our aviation medical examiner, Dr. Drew Samble, to get his take on the medications that she was taking.
Yeah, there's two drugs that I see that she was on. One is amitriptyline. Amitriptyline has been around for a long time, since the 1950s. Originally, it was designed to treat depression. It's no longer used to treat depression due to its side effects, which mainly include drowsiness, dry mouth, but it has an effect in today's world of treating chronic pain. From the FAA standpoint, if she was a pilot, it is a do not fly drug. All right. The second drug is the gabapentin. Gabapentin originally was designed to treat seizures. Okay. We can't see a history of her seizures in her record. And so therefore, the next most common reason it's used, I should say the most common reason today, is chronic pain. All right. And gabapentin can alter your cognitive functions, cause drowsiness. And so when you put those two drugs together, I'm very concerned about her cognitive state.
When the autopsy was performed, the cause of death was multiple blunt force injuries and the manner was accident. Now, some people in the comments on the previous video have speculated suicide, but there was no evidence to support this, and the Alabama Department of Forensic Sciences ruled accident, not suicide. But what they did find in her toxicology was significant levels of delta-9 THC and delta-8 THC, the active ingredient in marijuana. First off, I have heard that people are using marijuana medically, so I asked Dr. Drew about that. So is there any indication in this report that you looked over that she was prescribed medical marijuana for her conditions?
I couldn't find anything in the record. It's my understanding in the state of Alabama that there are some medical marijuana laws. From my reading, it's been held up with legal litigation. And so it's hard for this medical marijuana community to get started. It's my understanding that it can only get prescribed at a dispensary, which has not been allowed to proceed as of 2024.
So like you as a physician, you can't prescribe marijuana?
No, you cannot. Okay, I think you have to you have to take a course, apply for certification. Yeah, and your clinic has to be a designated dispensary of such a scheduled drug, because it is a scheduled drug.
Now, marijuana can stick around in the body for some time, 30 days or more, because the body stores it in the fat. The report confirmed she took marijuana before her shift. They just can't determine how much time before her shift. Was it right before or days before? We don't know. Marijuana might have contributed to her cognitive impairment. Certainly, it can dull the danger senses one might have. But all this is inconclusive. Her employer, Piedmont, has a policy in place that forbids marijuana usage, and she signed the document that covered those drug rules. But what about Piedmont employing her with MS and diabetes and putting her on the ramp? I asked Dr. Drew, what were the odds that Piedmont knew about her diseases?
Yeah, it's low. This day and age, you have a lot of privacy in regard to your medical history. And she probably wanted to work. She probably needed to work. And I bet it was a decent job in regard to, giving her some benefits and things like this. And there's a chance that nobody knew her specific medical history.
Between MS, the obesity/diabetes, and the marijuana use, what was the most contributing to her cognitive impairment on the ramp that day?
Dan, I'd have to say it was multifactorial, okay? She had good reasons. The MRI suggests her brain was involved with MS and it was progressive. And she's had it for 10 years. Is that right? No,
Eight
well,
years.
8 years at the
Yeah.
time. Okay. And then she was struggling to control her diabetes. On her first visit, she wasn't on insulin. On her second visit, they had placed her on insulin. And that's always a difficult disease to control in somebody that works very hard or has a bad diet. And she was overweight. Okay. And then her medication use, legally prescribed medication, such as gabapentin and the amitriptyline. Boy, those had to really cause some side effects in this case. So when that lead ramp agent, gave her that briefing, you have to wonder, did she understand it? And then when he motioned to her to get away from the rear of the aircraft, you wonder, could she even see him? Because we had an MRI over a year ago that showed involvement of the optic nerve. So these things, yeah, I think she really struggled to understand that safety briefing and to heed the warnings from that lead ramp agent on that day.
I want to remind everyone this is a tragic story. A family lost their mother, their daughter, they lost a friend. Clearly, she should not have been there that New Year's Eve day on the ramp. But please try and keep it respectful in the comments. And I want to thank Dr. Drew Sample for taking time to discuss this medical report with me. And finally, thanks to our sponsors that make these reports possible, like Z-Vision, the brightest landing and taxi lights out there. Go to xevision.com, check them out. If you haven't seen our report on the NTSB findings on Courtney's tragic death, check it out right here. Remember, superior judgment trumps superior skill. You guys take care.